Let us get started. This is Collections Conundrums. The idea is that you have questions and we will make up answers. My name is Janice Klein, and I currently serve as the Executive Director of the Museum Association of Arizona. I've worked previously as the Director of the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian, and before that as Registrar of the Field Museum's Anthropology Department. I've organized sessions and presented at numerous conferences and workshops over the past 30 years, and have served as Chair of the Registrar's Committee and the Small Museum Administrators Committee. With me on the panel of experts is Suzanne Hale, who has over 15 years of experience as a registrar collections manager at two university art museums, Colorado State University and Kansas State University, and I believe Colorado State has a new name? Yes. Which is in your program. She holds a BA in art history and fine art from Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, and an MA in museum studies from the University of Texas at Austin, and an MFA in painting from the Kansas State University in Manhattan, Kansas. She is the immediate past chair of the Collection Stewardship Committee and has served as the Professional Network's development chair over the past several years. John Simmons is the president of Museologica Consulting and adjunct curator of collections at the Earth and Mineral Sciences Museum and Art Gallery at Penn State University. And at the bottom of his letter, his signature goes on for days. He teaches museum studies classes for Kent State University, the National University of Columbia, and Museum Study LLC. His books include Foundations of Museum Studies, Evolving Systems of Knowledge, Museums, A History, and Things Great and Small, Collections Management Policies. And I apologize that I did not realize until 2 days ago that I did not include a slide with what I'm considering the big three of reference books. And then I thought maybe I'd bring them with me, and I forgot to do that too. But John is the author of one of the big three. If you do not have Things Great and Small, Collections Management Policies, second edition, you should get it. The other two major reference books that we always refer to are Museum Registration Methods, 5th edition, by Rebecca Buck and Jean Gilmore, commonly abbreviated MRM5 and known fondly as the Registrar's Bible. And the other book is Legal Primer for Museum Management, now in its second or third edition, written by Marie Malaro, who I once heard referred to as the She-Ra of the museum world. And edited with Ildiko de Angelis, semi-She-Ra. So the purpose of this session is to provide us all with an opportunity to discuss some of the many issues in collections care that do not necessarily have simple or easy solutions. And just because the three of us are up here, it doesn't mean we know all the answers. So we are happy to give you our thoughts on the matter, but we are also happy to hear anyone in the audience's thoughts on the matter as well. To get us started, I've pulled several what I'm calling non-hypotheticals from the collection specialist listserv. I don't want to embarrass anybody. There are no stupid questions, and I think all of these are pretty good. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to use the mic, write it on paper, and bring it up, or post it on the ARS app. And I will try to keep my eye on the ARS app so that I actually see people if they're asking questions. So here's our here's our panel, just in case you need to get in touch with us. And it is on the app, so. Okay, so our first question that we're going to sort of start playing with is numbering and the question of numbers and letters. So I am currently working on sorting thousands of photographs which none of us have ever done before. Each numbered with a combination of the three-part object ID and a series of up to 4 letters. This is one of my, actually, I love this question. Does double A follow A or Z? And where does where does AB go? And then a similar question, we recently received a large gift with multiple pieces of artwork, so each piece is receiving its own 3-part number. The challenge arises with 23 portfolios that were part of the gift. One of the portfolios is a series of prints. The prints are housed in 4 small boxes, each with a title page and glossary, all within one larger box. Should we use subnumbers to indicate the length, the individual pages, the boxes, and the portfolio, or should we use letters instead of a 5th number for all of the pages within the small box? So I'm going to just start by saying it's my personal opinion that if you have more than 26 subs, never use letters. Double letters are only going to confuse you. It would also be my preference. I'm getting a lot of feedback. Was the mic not on? Okay. Anyhow, it's also my preference to use all numbers, and unless it's something like a pair of shoes or a cup and saucer that are clearly together, because when you physically put a number on something, as those of you who are aging know, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between a B and a 6 on the eye chart. So that's my opinion, but.
I agree.
That's not fair.
May I start by saying how intimidating it is to be up here instead of out there looking at Rebecca Buck and Jean Gilmore, who can answer all these questions. AA does follow Z, in my opinion. There is an issue with complex numbers. Back in the dark ages, when I was an undergraduate, the tradition of using complex numbers and that incorporated a date and a type of collection and all this came because we needed our numbers to convey information. And those conveyed information about when we acquired objects or where we stored objects or what the objects were. But complex numbers are also very difficult to transcribe, in addition to the difficulty to see, which I share with Janice. A complex number means you're going to make far more transcription errors than a simple number. I like simple numbers. I start with 1, which is followed by 2, and which, by the way, goes infinitely. So you don't need a period, you don't need a subset, you don't need another letter, just 3 would come next. And I really like simple numbers, and I'm not really being facetious here, but they are far easier to work. When you put those numbers into your computer isn't going to use those numbers anyway. It's a deep, dark secret. The computer assigns brand new numbers to all of those fields and all of those objects. You never see them, but they do. So I think we should use computers as they should be used and use them to help us convey that information rather than trying to convey it through complex numbers, which get very large on small objects and get very complicated when you get into subsets and things. But basically, I do agree with you, Janice, that those letters are often very difficult to read and they can look like numbers. Avoid the letters if at all possible.
Does anyone want to speak up in defense of letters?
Just to use capitalize whenever possible. If you do use them.
And is that an English alphabet or Spanish? Is CH a letter? Do you put a tilde over your N?
Okay, so this is a related question, which is prefixes and suffixes. Most of us started life with prefixes and suffixes. This again is a question of a complex number trying to embed way more information into a catalog number than you actually need to. Some of you may have read one or more of my rants. Basically, a catalog number is the way you connect the object with its information. And if we wanted to call them Fred and Howard and Julie, that would be fine too, as long as Julie was written on the object and Julie was written on its accession file. This is a really complex question that has to do with material from various different buildings from a single architect. But the question is still, how much information can you embed, and should we have those prefixes? And it's got a related question, which is, when do you just throw in the towel and say, the hell with it all, I'm going to renumber?
You can also use barcodes or RFID tags if you need that information with the object. If you work a long way from your access to your database, there's other ways to convey those. I heard that we begin, though, as prefixes, and we end as suffixes. So, but no, there are other ways to convey that information, and I agree. Complex numbers lead to complex problems. Well, since you're halfway
have to
between
make
prefix
Suzanne.
and suffix, you're in the middle.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I was just going to say, you mentioned renumbering, and I think in some of the texts they say, oh, don't ever renumber. And you can sometimes, you really, really, really can. If it's, I think it's a reasonable number of pieces. It's not like, you know, thousands and thousands of things you want to renumber, but if it's a small set and it doesn't, it has worked for me in the past, I think it's okay, but you just also need to balance your time and figure out if it's worth it or not. So.
You can also just stop using your old numbering system, not renumber what was previously there, and start with a new numbering system. I have worked with collections that are multiple number systems in a single database, where we had multiple collections combined and for historical reasons wanted to preserve those original numbers, and it's not as complex as you would think.
Yeah, I worked with, the first collection I worked with had the initially prefixes. Unfortunately, there was A for Asia and AF for Africa, so you really had to be very careful with the object you were looking at. But they decided to go to a tripart system, and they knew they were going to do it in 1929, and they stored up, they didn't number objects for like 3 years. So there are infinitely more objects with a 1929 number than anything else. And I always remember that when the question comes up, well, if it does, you know, what year do we put on it? Sometimes there's information embedded in the number and it's nice, and sometimes there isn't. Okay, I think we've got one more. Oh, no, let's go back. So, any more numbering questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I have one. I'm in a situation where we did have these complex numbering systems, and so we decided as of 2018 we were changing to a simpler system. We were not going to go back and renumber the thousands of objects we already had. However, what I'm struggling with is how and where best to document that so that my future self 50 years from now is going to know what we did and why, and where and how is the best place to document that.
I think you want to do that in your database, but you could also just start a logbook for the collection with acid-free paper and a good permanent ink and write all these things down.
Where in the database?
Surely you have some kind of notation file where you can make a note when you change your numbering system as to what you've done. So there's some file, there should be some place where you can, in almost all databases, there's some file where you can, or field rather, where you can just stick information like that. That's.
Sorry to keep coming back to it, but this is a real struggle. So would you do it on
yeah.
each of the new records? That's my thing, is to have it somewhere.
I would write it down once when I change the system.
Actually, I would say twice. Once on the last record of the old number and once on the new record.
Okay. Yeah, Teresa says do it twice. She's right, of course. Once on the old number and once on the new number. You are right. That is a much clearer way to do it.
We've got a couple of questions over here.
I work in an art center and an archive, and the art center numbering is perfectly fine, but the archive goes back beyond me, and they have it numbered such as, for example, 1986.001.001. And I asked my supervisor, because it gets very complicated and it's kind of a mess. And so I asked if we could switch it to something that's more contemporary and how we've been taught to do it. And he wants to keep it as is. But I kind of was in the belief that we should start doing it the correct way, what I consider the correct way. So I guess I would like your feeling on that.
Yeah, I was actually, that's a good question. I was thinking of the leading zeros, and I used to have some leading zeros as well. And then I feel like I know when I see the leading zeros what they mean, and then the number that without them, and I go, oh, those are the same numbers. But not everybody knows that. So I think your system, your database management system should be able to function sorting the way it does without the leading zeros, and that's how I think you should go. What do you guys think?
You might just start doing it differently, and we've got a question coming up about different collections, and of course, archives do tend to number things differently.
And there is no right way. There are better ways, and it's the right way for your collection may not be the right way for somebody else's. So keep that in mind too.
Yeah, and you have to think about the computer system because, and how it's going to sort things. If that's a text field or a numeric field that number,
alphanumeric.
quote, number is in, and how your computer system will sort it. So you should think about that too.
And maybe you could also think too with how lengthy it gets. I mean, if some of these objects are very teeny tiny, and to actually have to mark them and inscribe them, it gets, so that might be a good argument if you're not wanting to use the leading zeros, because it takes up more space on the object, and they get longer and longer and longer.
I have a picture I show my students from the collection where I'm adjunct curator. It's a little mineral specimen, and I have it next to a penny, and it's a little smaller than the penny, and it's got a 6-digit number on an adhesive tag that someone wrapped all the way around the specimen to get it on. So you have to turn it to read it, and of course 6 digits can then turn into 12. And it's also got the museum's initials in front, but you can barely see the object, and of course it's also adhesive, so that's...
But for you specifically, would you change it, I guess, for in your own view, for your own collections?
I would say if the computer system doesn't need it,
Right.
that
Yeah.
I would argue against. I mean, it is, if you can tease out why that system was started, and it's purely because the computer was not going to sort properly, and it will now, then I think you have a good argument for going forward, getting rid of your leading zeros.
Hi, our collection is majorly archaeological, so I'm dealing with like teeny tiny pottery sherds, and what I'm finding is because of like who donated them, there's already like 6 different types of numbers written on them, and what that does is that takes up space to where I have to decide whether to not write on the object, or the only space where I can write on the object is, let's say, the side that has the decoration for the pottery. So that's the big issue I'm facing, is deciding, and also the other thing is those numbers were written with like permanent marker.
Sure.
So I can't remove them.
I think maybe one of the issues in some of this is looking into alternative numbering techniques. Sometimes with archaeological collections, depending on how unique each piece is, you can start with a bag of 5 sherds in a plastic bag with a number inside the bag and on the bag and under the bag.
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty much what I've been doing, is putting the number like everywhere I can, since I can't write
yeah.
it on the object.
Because sometimes your number is, I mean, all of those pieces may be staying together, and there may come a point where you want to be able to identify them individually, but not always. As I have often explained to people, archaeological material tends to sit in paper bags
Yeah.
on the shelf. unfortunately. And then there may come a time that you want it to be published or studied, and at that point, you can figure out whether it needs to get its individual number or something. Or you can just put them in, each shirt in a nice Ziploc bag with the number in the bag, on the bag.
It's also possible to take all those other numbers, which I presume are numbers from the field or collectors or whatever.
They're random
Well,
numbers.
but whatever they are, include a searchable field in your database where those numbers can be linked to the object
Yes,
number.
I do that as well.
Yeah, because you never know when one of those numbers is going to pop up and be extremely useful.
Yes, no, I do that
Yes,
as well.
okay.
So it was mainly I can't write it on the object, so I didn't know if I was like going about the proper way of doing it.
I think Janice's solution is great.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to move on to accessions. We hopefully will have time at the end for coming back for any kind of miscellaneous question. So this is a very complicated, she gave the money, somebody said, oh, she gave the gift, they sent a deed of gift, she signed the deed of gift because it came in the mail. Then we found out that it was only partially a gift, and what is it? It's the real question. And is there a way to basically go back and make it right with a donor, That's always a big question. It's like, well, we sent you a form, but it was the wrong form. But we really do know what we're doing. So I'm not sure whether anybody has a thought on this.
I think for the credit line, you can say purchase made possible by a donation from and name the person. And that sort of weasels out of all of the complications. But it was unclear from the text where the other half of the money came from. So let us presume for a moment the other half of the money came from the museum itself. So you have a donor giving the money for half of it. And I'm not sure why a deed of gift was sent, because the objects were not donated. It was a donation of money. But if you want a credit line, you can say this purchase made possible by a donation from this person. But you don't really, I would not count the objects purchased as a donation because they were, in fact, a purchase.
And I think maybe the conundrum here is not so much what to do about this, but how do we get accurate information from the development office or other parts of the museum, and trying to check back and set up your system so that, in fact, you are getting all the accurate information and you don't get here's a painting that was a gift from, when in fact, and maybe some education on in your development office explaining that there's a difference, and you can even pull in the IRS by saying there is a difference in terms of tax deductibility, whether it is a gift of an object or a gift of money. All right, the IRS. I unfortunately am old enough to remember the Tax Reform Act of 1984. Which is when the 82, 83, and the 82, 82 forms came in. And the general idea behind it was that they wanted a way, one of the ideas behind it was that the IRS wanted a way to check on the values of things that were being used for non-charitable tax deductions. So they set up a system in which if a museum gets rid of or a charitable organization gets rid of a non-cash contribution, they get informed of how much they got for it so that they can compare, should they ever have the time or inclination, what the donation deduction was with what the museum or the other charitable organization ultimately realized in terms of a cash value. So I believe it is now 3 years. If you want to not have to deal with this, then you can sit on the object for 3 years, and you don't need to file a form. If the 8283 was not filed, if you never signed it, then there is no way that your donor would have legally taken that kind of deduction. So has that made it clear as mud? Basically, if you've signed the 8283 form as part of the donation, if you remove that object from the collection, not necessarily from the museum, if you remove it from the museum, if the museum no longer has ownership, then you need to send the IRS the 8282 form saying, basically, we sold it for much less money than the donor claimed it was worth. One of the things to remember about this is that the IRS really doesn't care what it's doing in your museum if it's serving a related purpose to your mission. So if it's no longer in what you consider your permanent collection, but it is in the education collection, you have not gotten rid of it. Somebody want to clarify that for me?
I would add to that. I noticed that in the original question, the person is saying, I was told the donor did not want a tax deduction, but I'm not convinced. Well, that's really not our business in the museum. We don't want to get involved with whether the donor took a tax deduction or not, because that's a clear conflict of interest on our part. So if you want to cover yourself, I would file the forms and let it be the donor's issue, because the donor may have changed his or her mind and filed for the tax deduction, but that's something that we should have nothing to do with, and we certainly don't want to get involved with values at that point.
Here is a question about related and unrelated use, and taking in a work that is going to be basically sold. In that case, it is not a related use to your mission. Your mission is not selling artwork. So there is it is possible to define related use very broadly. If it is hanging anywhere in your museum, if it is being used anywhere in your museum, you can usually claim that there's an educational purpose behind it. I worked at a museum where some objects ended up in cases in the restaurant as an illustration of food techniques, and while it may have looked like they were decorative, they were educational in their purpose. You guys are I'm gonna have to shut up so
You're
you can
doing a
just
great job.
Stop nodding your head.
We're sitting here in awe.
When I have a problem, I
All right.
call these two people. I mean,
All right,
they're going to be
questions
buzzing.
about accessions, accession policies, practices. You all know how to do this. Oh, yeah, random questions are good.
I have a
too.
random question related to,
So I work for an Indian tribe, and the community members, they see the museum and they're like, oh, I have this thing. And whether I see value in it or not, they come and they give it to us. They could be copies of books or copies of magazines or article, things that they see as important, but as a collections professional, as a museum professional, I'm like, I don't see, it's a copy, we also have the book. So what do I do with those things to still respect them and not be like, oh, this is worthless? Do I take it in? I just started to put things in a box. Well, kind of organize them and try to put them into a box and put them into an archive and, accession it into more of an archive kind of way but with the unrelated use, I'm never going to put it on exhibit, but I don't want to lose the value. I don't want to, so it's just kind of like I'm getting all this random things, but I just don't know what to do with it.
Suzanne will give you an answer.
okay, this is what I think. I almost feel like this is sort of a little bit out of your realm in your job role, and perhaps more people in your staff need to be consulted, and that's why you have a collection committee and explain what your collection's about, and that's why, not going to happen. Okay. Well, the other thing I was thinking too, you could come up with the most complicated numbering system you could think of and apply it to it. I'm just kidding.
I think, let's take you mentioned unrelated use. Anything you use something for an educational purpose in the museum is a related use as far as the IRS is concerned, so we'll take that off the table. Then we're looking at a question of, and it's not just in tribal museums, you may be unhappy to know, or happy to know, lots and lots of museums have an issue where there are people who have a sort of superordinal right to put things in your museum, whether it is the university trustee or your big donor or any of those things, that we unfortunately end up with stuff that basically takes up space more than it's useful. And everybody has to come to some kind of understanding about how they're going to identify, store, and maybe eventually make use of that material. And a lot of museums, even ones that have what we would consider archives, have research collections. And provide their donor with a lovely deed of gift saying, this is a really wonderful thing. We're going to put it in our research collection, which sounds great, for use by tribal members and those who are interested in tribal history. Or we're going to put this god-awful painting of your great-grandmother, who has nothing to do with our museum, and is just really in our developing archives so that people who come and want to do research on the history of our institution will know that your great-grandmother had a really, really bad portrait done. There are those kinds of ways of not necessarily sharing with the donor that it's going in the back closet, and coming up with a way that you can keep track of it and identify what it is. And you never know. There may come a time when your major donor dies and somebody wants to do a retrospective exhibit of awful paintings of his ancestors. So that would be my, just because someone gives you something in a way that they think it's going to be used doesn't mean you have to use it that way.
I would also say that you should have a good collections management policy. That should include a scope of collection statement. The scope should describe what is in your collection and what kinds of things you want to collect. You should have a good accession policy, which is the best defense against de-accessioning. The accession policy should state what kind of things you accept and which you don't. You can have a categories of collection description that would describe your research collection, the ugly portrait collection, all of these other things. And if you don't have those in your policy, tomorrow would be a really good time to start working on that. By the way, there's a nice book for sale over in the expo that details these. But seriously, a good collections management policy will solve that kind of problem before it lands on your desk.
Could I just clarify one thing? I agree with John, but when you do the deed of gift, you aren't suggesting that we put in there which collection it's going into or what it's going to be used for. It is just thank you for the gift, and not include these restrictions as it's going into research or it's being put in a box.
My tendency was, if I wasn't assigning it an accession number to go into the permanent collection, I would write research collection or archives in the place of the number, so that the donor, and it would be something that I would make clear up front, that this is very useful for X purpose, and maybe not necessarily say, we don't want it in the collection, but we're going to use it for this, but to sort of play up how valuable it will be for the non-collection purpose.
Just one other quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be in some form of communication other than the deed of gift?
Well, You deciding which collection it's going to go in within your institution is not a restriction. You're accepting the gift. You then decide where to put it. That's your business. If the donor says this must go into the permanent collection, this must be exhibited, those are restrictions, and you should deal with those before you accept the gift. But you could choose to communicate that on the deed of gift. There's no real need to, because a gift means someone takes an object, and this is mine, and I'm now giving it to you. I have now transferred ownership, and with that, I've transferred all interest in that object. Now, you put my gift in your research collection? Well, I have no standing to argue that because it's a gift. If the person has standing to argue which collection it should go in, by the way, that needs to go in archives, then that's not a gift because there was not, in fact, a complete transfer of ownership. And it's not a gift.
Actually, that goes in the hands-on collection.
And one other thing, too, I just was wondering, your question made me think about, I mean, I can't even imagine those of you who work for probably memorial museums and things come to your door. And I think when we were at one of the memorials for MPMA, the Mountain Plains Museum Association, it was very interesting, the number of items that are left there and that how they handle those things. So those types of fellow friends in those collections might be a good resource to ask as well, because I know you end up with a lot of things and have to figure out what to do with them.
And I just wanted to say something about deed of gift, which we don't have any questions about. A deed of gift is not it is a procedural requirement. All that is required for a gift to become real is an offer, an acceptance, and a transfer of property. The deed of gift puts all those things in a nice package, but if you don't have a deed of gift and you have a letter saying, I want to give you this wonderful thing, and the museum says, thank you for this wonderful thing, and then the donor gives you the wonderful thing, you have completed the legal aspects of a gift.
One more aspect of this, if you meet resistance, if you have a director, for example, who wants you to take all of this stuff in and does not want to bother with writing a good accessions policy, you can point out that every object you take into your collection takes resources. And you can also ask the question, when are they going to build you a new collection facility, hire you a new assistant, buy you new support materials, art? What future gifts do they intend to turn down because it is now full of copies of books?
Okay, moving on to deaccessions. This is a question that comes up pretty often. The question is, if you're deaccessioning something, do you tell the donor?
I think telling the donor is a nice idea. I wouldn't do it because the reason is simple. If you are telling the donor that you no longer have their object and they can have it back or buy it back, you are presuming they have a claim on it. If it was a gift, they do not. If it was a donation, they gave up that claim. And by notifying any donor that you're deaccessioning their object means you're saying, well, you still really actually have some kind of ownership in this object. And that leads you to quite a quagmire. What about the donor's widow or widower? Or what about the donor's children or the donor's grandchild who shows up and says, well, you know, really, Grandpa left me that clock in the will. He didn't really mean it was a donation. It was really a loan to you, and I'm supposed to inherit it. So this leads to all kinds of problems. So I would argue that although it seems nice in the abstract that you would notify a donor that this property is available, I personally think that is a really bad idea.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that runs you into VARA, into the rights of a living artist are a little different. But if it was a gift, there are restrictions on what you can do. You cannot destroy or alter the work of a living artist, but you're not required, as I understand it, under VARA to give it back to them. If someone else might want to correct that, as far as I know, the VARA protects the integrity of the artwork. It does not in any way link ownership of that artwork back to the artist under those circumstances. The VARA is intended to prevent art from being modified in some way or destroyed. Yeah, and of course it protects copyright. Yeah, good point.
I had the same question, but specifically regarding notification of that living artist. Not that the artwork would be returned to the artist, but what's your view on the obligation to notify
Notifying, I'm
The
sorry.
artist.
a living
Notifying
artist
the
of
artist
a
that you were
deaccession?
deaccessioning the work. You're not required to do that, but that's reasonable. But offering them the chance to get it back themselves directly is another issue.
Right. Thank you.
You know, it's kind of sad because artists rarely make any money off the original work, because usually the first person that purchases it gets the best deal, and if the art is the value of the work goes up, it's every subsequent owner makes the money from it, which is kind of sad, and I don't know what the solution to that is, but notifying them that it's on the market is not a bad thing, but you just want to make sure that is not imply in any way that they have a claim to it.
Yeah, one of the reasons you might want to do that is many artists include in their resume or portfolio where their work is. So it would be a courtesy.
Really good point.
All right, disposition. This is the low-end disposition. We have things that we don't want in our collection. Sotheby's turned their nose up at it. The local auction house turned their nose up at it. We can't get the museum down the street to even take it in off their front porch if we leave it there. So what are some of the alternatives to disposing of deaccession material?
We like it. No, sorry.
Yeah, I agree. These are great ideas because it is likely that the hospital will probably be a nonprofit, may or may not. Habitat for Humanity is, so this would be transferring to another nonprofit. It would be a matter of keeping these objects in the public trust. These are both great uses for this. I presume this is probably that ugly portrait of the grandmother that because they've asked
we
all
have to
these
keep
museums.
that.
So possibly some assisted living facility where you and I might wind up looking at it someday would be good. Someday soon.
What about a thrift store that raises money for a nonprofit?
Yeah, that's another great idea. A thrift store that raises money for a nonprofit. But this is after the museum has made a very strong, good faith attempt to keep the object in the
And
public
you've
trust.
documented it.
And you document it. But yeah, at that point, you can also just sell it for profit. But I think the idea of transferring to another nonprofit is terrific.
Yeah.
Yeah, what about the community museum doing a sale of treasures? This can also lead to problems because it can lead to the public perception that you take things into your collection to sell them. It can lead to the perception you're selling stuff out of your collection. If you want to sell them, I would work through a third party and have the name removed. I have had a couple of experiences with that. I was on the board of a local history museum, and we had a number of exhibit panels that had photographs on them, and we needed to junk the panels. So we checked every photograph. None of them were original. These were copies made from negatives. They were not the original photographs, and there was really no way to get them off the panels, so we put everything in the dumpster. Sure enough, a local dumpster diver found them, and the next thing you know, there's a letter to the editor of the paper that the new director of the museum is throwing out priceless objects from the museum, looting the archives, which is, of course, not what happened. I had another experience with a client, and the client, it was a university museum, had received a large number of objects from a donor with the agreement that they would take what they wanted and the rest would be sold at auction. So none of this had been accessioned. And the university made arrangements with an auction house to sell the stuff. And lo and behold, a few months later, they found on the internet site for the auction house the stuff for auction saying from the collection of XYZ University, which was incorrect. And it also reflected very badly on the institution. So I would avoid any direct link, but you can go to a third-party seller. It's kind of like one of the golden rules for deaccessioning is use someone else's dumpster.
The golden dumpster?
Yeah, and that also goes for selling through your shop. People, no matter what you do, people will not see the difference between selling the collections and actually deaccessioning.
Hi there. I have a question about related to deaccessioning. We have multiple sites within our museum system, and one of our museum systems recently undertook a collections rationalization project, and we discovered that in the early 90s, numbers were applied to a large amount of material that was actually borrowed from members in the community. Problem number one. And this was all material that was not on display and it was stored. So we did spend a long time trying to follow up with the people that we borrowed the material from, and have hit a lot of walls, as you can well imagine, because some of this happened 30 years ago. So my question is, at what point can you say we've done our due diligence, or are we just stuck with this stuff forever? Can you deaccession something you've never accessioned?
No. You can't. You'd have to accession it and then deaccession it. What I would do first is make sure you have done due diligence on ownership and contact whoever this stuff was borrowed from first. If, in fact, you cannot find that organization or they no longer claim it, you can check and see if your state has a found in collection law, which many states, but not all of them do. And you can use the terms of that law, which requires you to make a good faith effort and wait a certain amount of time. But otherwise, you must make really sure you know who the owner is, because you cannot get rid of somebody else's stuff. Yeah. This is the problem with stuff left at your museum, is you don't own it and you can't get rid of it legally because you don't own it. You need to try to find the owner or find a legal way to assume ownership. And for those states that do not have found in collection laws, I would recommend
old loans, not found in collection.
Well, but it would be if the original owner is not available, a loan would then be the same as a found in collection. Where this is a case where you can't find them. But in that case, I would hire a lawyer and have the lawyer work with the state, because you can, under common law, you can probably work out some arrangement. But yeah, this would only be if that original lender was no longer available for whatever reason.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I believe, and I'm not sure whether it's the Collection Stewardship website or the ARC's website, does have a link to all of the state found in collection and old loans legislation.
ARC's just updated their list recently.
So that is the Association of Registrars and Collection Specialists, and on their website you will find a link to all of the state laws dealing with what you need to do to get rid of stuff that you first need to claim ownership of. It sounds really ridiculous.
There's a good chapter in MRM 5 about that also. The only thing out of date in that chapter is the list, but the rest of the information is still quite valid.
Quick question on related to the state laws. I'm in a federal museum in the state of New York, so I'm not sure, do I follow the state laws, or like I don't know that there's a
Can you
federal
reveal
founding
the agency
collection?
that you
Is it
Department of Defense.
you're going to have to
you know, they play with guns.
you need to actually find out what the Department of Defense regulations are about disposing of material, because many federal and state agencies have regulations and requirements that are totally ridiculous for museums, but you need to do that. Oh, yeah.
Your objects are probably considered federal property.
Yeah.
Well, yes, but what I mean is I have one loan from Connecticut. I've been trying to get in contact with the owner. We've had the objects now for 30 years, and so far as the state of New York is concerned, I've done my due diligence. Technically, I could dispose of it how I wish, but I'm not sure whether or not I follow under New York's due diligence laws, and looking up something from the DOD, it's like, they're like, oh, just take it to DRMO and dump it. And I'm like, guys, that's really not what we're supposed to do.
I would try a little harder to get an answer out of DOD. I think Janet's right. You need to check with the agency.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Where is she? This is how my museum handles abandoned artifacts. And we're a certified curatorial facility, so our collections policy was kind of, the Texas Historical Commission helped write it and make sure all the legal issues were solved. So in a case of an abandoned artifact, once it's unfortunately been there for 15 years, and after you've made efforts to contact the possible owner, like I've had to send out letters and I keep track of those letters and try to make phone calls, and you keep record of all that effort, and then once you can't reach them via that means, you have to post in newspapers in the surrounding area trying to contact the owner of those artifacts. And then pretty much once you've done your due diligence in having the newspaper ad, sending letters, and once it's been there for 15 years, it's been determined abandoned at the museum, and it becomes property of the museum. And then the museum can find a way to dispose of it. So I'm trying to find a home for some Fort Walton pottery, so if anyone is interested in some Fort Walton pottery for an education collection, hit me up at the end of this.
Okay. All right, props or other collections. What do you do with them? Many of us now have a separate set of numbers for props collections, because you should be tracking where they came from and where they are. And I will tell you that sometimes you will look through what was your props collection or is your props collection and discover that something that's been sitting there for 50 years actually is fairly important and should be accessioned. So it's something you want to keep track of.
Yeah. I think that, again, with the numbering system, trying to keep it simple, but also distinguish maybe the way that you do it from your regular collection, if this is a different collection that has sort of different types of uses and standards and things.
We just switched over to this, where we took a bunch of stuff and we call it museum support property.
A bunch of stuff.
And, yep, everything from plastic loaves of bread to, we had farm implements, and well, I don't know why. But, and those are the types of things that thank God we're able to just take those because they are museum support property and render them useless according to the Army rules, which means, cutting them in half and then chucking them in the dumpster. So there's plenty of things that we've been able to dispose of just because it's museum support property and outside of.
And that's a lot of time and a lot of work. I mean, it's makes us all think about having a good collection management plan. But no, it makes it, I mean, when things come to the door and someone's like, oh, we should really accept this batch of stuff, and you're kind of like, let's really, really, really think about this.
If I could just reiterate Janet's point, you do want to number these in some fashion because you need to do an inventory on them. You don't want to mix them up with your database, but Janet is quite right. Often what are in those props collections, a surprising number of times, turn out to be things that actually shouldn't be there. And by doing an inventory, you're probably going to catch those mistakes.
And as I'm sure we'll find in one of the big three books, your collections policy, you will want to write a separate collections policy for each of these other types of collections if your handling, if access, if loaning is different from the way you handle your permanent collection. I'm going to skip past this question because this is a really archives photograph question, which I think deserves its own session. Having had some conversations with, so do archival materials belong in the collection or not? I'm just going to go past it so we can get to the last few questions. Whose loan agreement?
Well, this is really an issue of what the objects on the loan can be used for rather than whose loan agreement in a way. So I like to trick my students. I tend to be very devious when I teach, which is why no one ever takes 2 classes from me in a row. helps keep the numbers down. So I like to ask people, what is considered standard use for an object on loan? And I'm usually so sneaky, I give them a bunch of options, like, well, you can change the hanging hardware to fit your exhibition, you can add security things to it, you can make sure that you get a good photograph of it to use in the brochure. All of these things are wrong. What you can use a loaned object for depends entirely on what the loan agreement says. The loan agreement is a contract. It's a loan. These are not your things. You cannot presume to do anything with them, the way they're handled, the way they're hung, for in the case of art, the way they're stored. Nothing is presumed. You should have all of this spelled out. So I am real keen on putting this stuff as part of the loan agreement itself. In this case, I believe it is a list for borrowers of what you can do, which is fine, but I would actually include that in the loan agreement. This can mean your loan agreement goes several pages of very fine print, but it is better to do that than let someone presume that they can do something with your object that they cannot. And even if the borrowing institution is a place that knows full well how to handle the object, I would still include that because now it is written in your loan agreement. It is a matter of contract. If something goes wrong, if an object is damaged, you now have a legal basis for making the claim because you laid out the conditions. I mean those.
Yeah, the one thing, my perspective has always been, and this is something a lawyer told me, one contract per agreement. You never sign, never sign two contracts for the same activity. Because otherwise, if there's a problem, you don't know which one is going to apply and you're going to end up in court.
I might add one thing
Yeah.
too to that, and because sometimes you're trying to figure out, well, whose loan form do we use, incoming or outgoing, and it does depend, but we're finding that if we're the one loaning the object out, and it's usually, and I want to make sure I'm putting down the stipulations on that myself. So if it's outgoing, then I like the policy to follow the object so that I can put in these details that we want.
That's your right as owner.
Yeah.
Well, good thing.
The very rude rule of thumb is my object's my contract. There will be times, there have been times that you are dealing with an entity, with a parent organization that insists that their agreement be signed. And on those times that I've absolutely had to do that, I have put lines through the entire loan agreement and written conditions as in the agreement provided by my museum, and then signed it.
She's tough.
And I thought I was mean.
I know. I was thinking, oh, you're so nice later when I talk to you.
Okay, we have a question from the phone. Whoa. A house and the land it sat
Where's
on
the
was
bathroom? Oh, sorry.
gifted to my museum. The house was still full of contents from the former owner. Relatives began calling the museum to ask for certain items in the house. We were advised by our lawyer to give no access until the estate of the donor was settled. Can you talk about the obligation to keep the contents in the house and about any objects that might be on the property but not inside the house, like a grinding stone?
So the terms of the gift were that the house and its
The land
contents,
and the
the
house
land
and
and the
its
house,
contents
then
were given
just-
to the museum.
if they're on the land, then they go with the property, I would presume. Especially if they are, related to the house. If someone's junked their car on the lot, that would be different. But I would presume that any property related to the house and the use of the property would be included in that. And I think that's a very wise thing. You don't respond to those requests from the family until the estate is settled and you are fully inventoried. But that is a really common thing. Any of you who work with small history museums have probably run into this, because people will show up claiming ownership of something that you may or may not have the proper documentation to prove it was a loan or a gift, but this happens a lot.
We've had lenders pass away while we have their object on loan, and we cannot give that object back until a will has been sent to us, and the executor tells us
Yeah.
who it needs to go to.
Yeah, so she said that they have had lenders who expire before the loan does, and they are not allowed to. Well, I'm just rephrasing. And so they cannot return those objects until the will has gone through probate and the estate has been settled, which is correct, because you don't want to give them to the wrong person. They're not yours to give, and you know.
So we're pretty much at the end of our time. You've expired? No, not yet. The time has expired. But I hope what we've managed to do is give a few insights into some of the questions that get answered all the time with "it depends," and remember to ask your colleagues. There is virtually nothing that one of us has not seen, if not more. So feel free to ask, and there are no stupid questions when it comes to collections. And sometimes it's, how the hell do I deal with my supervisor who has no understanding of what's going on? Usually threatening them with "the IRS says," any sentence that starts with "the IRS says" will help you get your way. So.
For those of you who are entering the profession, who are young, don't be afraid to ask questions. It does not make you look like you don't know what you're doing. Those of us who've been in the profession for ages, I can claim over 40 years, we ask questions all the time, and you'll see our names appearing on the listserv asking questions of our colleagues. To me, one of the best things about the museum field is how we help each other. And you'll find on Museum L and many other listservs a very collegial group of people who will do everything they can to help you out when you have a problem. So never be afraid to ask.
What he said. Thank you to my panelists.
I agree.